What began in June 2024 as a space to amplify autistic and neurodivergent voices has grown into something far bigger. A platform for raw, honest conversations about neurodivergence, disability, burnout, inclusion, mental health, and how our identities shape the way we move through the world. From the start, our mission has been clear: to go beyond the headlines, beyond stereotypes, and explore the real lived experiences that often go unheard. Over the past year, we've spoken with parents, professionals, educators, advocates, and everyday people, all united by a commitment to building a more inclusive and accessible world. But what's mattered most is the community. Those of you who listen, share, and remind us, finally, someone gets it. Thank you for being here. This is just the beginning.
Looking for authentic conversations that go beneath the surface? Tune in now to the Deep Dive podcast. Visit us at www.deepdiveau.net. That's deepdiveau.net. And follow us across your favorite platforms: YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, and Facebook. Just search at the Deep Dive AU. Join us as we dive deep into stories of neurodivergence, lived experience, and creating a more inclusive world. The Deep Dive podcast. Conversations that matter. Stories that connect.
This is the Deep Dive podcast. And here is your host, Michael Coles.
Chelsea Luca is an autistic ADHD psychologist, author, and parent of 2 neurodivergent children. With a passion for neurodiversity-affirming practice, Chelsea draws on both her professional and lived experience to support neurodivergent individuals and their families. Through her work at ADHDer Psychology, she empowers parents, educators, and therapists to foster understanding, self-worth, and connection in neurodivergent communities. Chelsea is also the author of Square Me, Round World, a collection of stories that highlight the experiences of growing up feeling different, and she delivers impactful talks, training, and resources designed to create a more inclusive and neuro-affirming world. Chelsea Luca, welcome to the Deep Dive.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Okay, so you describe yourself as a late identified autistic ADHDer. Can you share what led to your diagnosis and how that shift affected your self-understanding?
I sure can. I'm terrible with actual times in terms of length of time, but essentially, we had some, I guess, a range of tricky or complicating things happening in that we had COVID, we had my second child was born, and then our town was hit by a really big flood. And so lots of things were completely flooded and had to be rebuilt and all that sort of stuff. And with all that change, I noticed my oldest kiddo was finding it quite tricky, and I was kind of sort of reflecting on what was going on for them and what might be, making things hard for them. And after a little bit of reflection, I was like, I think potentially they're autistic. And now my oldest child is a replica of myself. It was a bit of a copy-paste situation. So it wasn't very much of a leap for me to go, hang on, if they're autistic, then that means that I'm probably autistic too. So it was a pretty fast realization after that point. And of course, I did a deep dive into the research and, did a lot of reading. And then we both went through our own assessments, also discovered that ADHD was in the mix there. And so kind of my eldest child kind of reflected it to me, and just gave me the opportunity to see it outside of myself. But yeah, it wasn't a very far jump from there once I kind of figured out that was going on.
Okay, so how has discovering your neurodivergent identity changed your approach to personal self-compassion and radical acceptance?
I think self-compassion has been the biggest thing that has come for me from understanding my neurotype. And I think that's been the thing that's made the biggest change for me. So for me, the more I learned about being autistic and ADHD and the two neurotypes and kind of what was, I guess, quite common for people that had those neurotypes, the more I was able to be understanding when things maybe were harder or didn't quite work out the way that I'd hoped they would. So for an example, I like to I often use this story when I reflect on kind of how my self-compassion has grown. I got to work one morning and I realized that I had left my laptop at home. And I used my laptop all through the day, so it wasn't really an option not to have it. So I had to turn around and drive back home and get my laptop. And I noticed that my self-talk while I was driving home was, like you'd put your computer on the charger and normally you leave it in your bag. And it was a really busy morning this morning. You had a lot of stuff to do. You were juggling a lot of stuff, so it's not really surprising that you left your laptop at home because, it wasn't your usual routine and you were more busy than usual. So actually, it's probably surprising we haven't left it at home more than we actually have. So I noticed that I didn't blame myself, and I wasn't, going like, "Oh, you idiot! What are you thinking?" I was just like, "Oh, this is so frustrating." And I was also saying, "Oh, now your day's thrown off. You're probably feeling a bit uncomfortable, and it's not a great way to start the day, but it's okay. We can get back into the office and we can kind of catch up and it'll be okay." But yeah, it is tough. It's a tough way to start your day. I reflected and was really proud of, before that probably would have been a very self-critical conversation. And, I was quite proud that it had just become more automatic to actually have that compassion for myself. And that made such a big difference, rather than starting the day feeling like, oh, I messed up. Like I started the day going, oh, this is hard, but, it's okay. We'll get through it. And I think, I wouldn't have been able to do that if I didn't understand my brain and the way that it works.
Okay, so as a parent of two neurodivergent children, how has your own neurodiversity informed your parenting strategies?
A lot. I think that even before I knew that I was autistic ADHD and I knew that my children were neurodivergent, I think I was probably still parenting in quite a neurodivergent friendly way, I guess. We did, visual schedules with my kiddos from when they were, probably one. And we used a lot of visual timers and a lot of lists and things like that. Looking back, part of that was probably to help myself, but I'd also recognized that it was helpful for my kiddos. But since I guess we've had more understanding of our different neurotypes and kind of how we all operate, definitely adopt a lot more of a low end style of parenting. In that, I guess we all kind of really we all reflect on, a lot of the shoulds, and kind of question whether they're things that we really want to adhere to as a family. So we try, like, our lives are a lot quieter, I guess, than many other families would be. We're really conscious about, what we take on and what we agree to. And I guess we try and work quite collaboratively as a team to try and kind of figure out how best to meet everyone's needs. So, for example, sometimes my kiddos need to be making really loud noises because that's what their bodies need. I find really loud noises really hard sometimes. So, we try and work together and go like, oh, I can see you really want to be making loud noises right now. I'm really finding it tricky. How do we, what should we do here? And they might actually bring me my noise cancelling headphones, or I might say, I'm going to go into a different room, or they might go outside. So, I guess we're just really working on understanding each other, and, trying to do life a bit more in the way that works for us rather than in the way that we think we're supposed to be doing life.
Okay, so what are your key insights on raising neurodivergent kids in today's world, especially when it comes to sensory overload or masking?
Yeah, it's a very sensory overwhelming world, I think. So I guess I try to be quite conscious and mindful when it comes to thinking about what sort of sensory experiences my kiddos might be having. But I also pair that with the knowledge that my executive functioning doesn't always do the thing I'm expecting it to. So we pretty much always have like a sensory kit in our cars. So we might always have like earmuffs in our cars. We always have like sensory stuff for our kiddos and for ourselves as well. I guess just being really mindful of the different things that might impact sensory wise and seeing what we can put in place, to kind of help with those things. I've already forgotten the second part of the question. Sensory, and then there was something else. Masking. Yeah,
I think sensory
I'll get there.
overload or masking.
Masking. Yeah. Um, I think in relation to masking, it's such a complex topic. But I guess, I've tried to be really open with my kids about masking and teach them what it is, but also teach them, the purpose of masking, which is, for most of the time, ultimately to keep us safe, and so, it's not that masking is discouraged. It's more understanding that it happens, why it happens, what it might look like, but then also being able to recognize the impact that that has on our body. So, it might be that we go somewhere that really feels like it's somewhere that we have to mask, but that might mean we come home and we're really, really tired. So we have a visual on our fridge, which is 4 little batteries for all of the members of my family. And we then have little magnets to kind of illustrate where we are in terms of how charged our batteries are. And so, that might be something that we might use if we've gone somewhere that's particularly overwhelming, maybe sensory wise, or even if we felt like we have had to mask quite a lot. We might come back to those visuals and go like, whoa, like I'm super drained now. What do we need to put in place now being so drained?
Okay, so how's your family adapt energy accounting at home, and what tips do you offer other parents?
Perfect. That's a nice follow-on question from that example. So we talk a lot about energy accounting. Energy accounting is one of the biggest things that I like to talk about, with my clients, but also with my kiddos. And I will talk about it with them from both perspectives in terms of sharing my kind of where my capacity is, but also helping them to recognize where their capacity is and kind of what might be charging for them and what might be draining for them. So I guess in terms of, talking about it from my perspective, I'll often share, oh, like that was really loud where we were, and now I feel really drained. And so I think I just need to sit here and quiet for a little bit so that I can charge up. I might also talk about energy accounting when, maybe they want to go somewhere or maybe they want to do something and I just don't have the energy to do that. So I might share, hey, my battery's really low and I actually can't do this thing that you want to do right now, or I can't go to this place. But, if I'm able to charge myself up a bit, by doing this, then maybe we'll be able to do that later, or we'll be able to go to that place later. And then from their perspective, we've also got 2 big lists up on our fridge in terms of like things that might be draining and things that might be charging. So we might look at, oh, like your body is looking like your battery's really flat. What have you been doing? And it might be they've had, it might be Thursday and they've had 4 days at school and they're just completely drained. Or, we might have gone somewhere really busy and exciting. Or they might have had all day at home resting, so they might actually be really charged. So we talk a lot about energy accounting, and I find that's really, really helpful in helping us to kind of understand how we're going.
Okay, so what motivated you to write Square Me Round World and share stories from your neurodivergent childhood?
Well, it was a very impulsive decision. Um, I wrote the very first story when I was in Melbourne, down in Melbourne for the Yellow Ladybugs conference, not this year, but the year before. And I got the idea first because I wanted to write stories about autistic and ADHD life that were just stories. So that was still interesting stories for kiddos to read without, really, I guess, overt information in them. So that's where I started. I wrote the first story in the book. Well, no, it's the second story in the book about the two owls. And I wrote that on my phone in my hotel room at midnight. So it was a very impulsive start to the book. I then just kept writing short stories, and I really intended just to share them with my kiddos and maybe my clients, just because I thought they were fun. But I shared them with a few people, and they were all saying, "Oh, you should publish this book." And I know nothing about writing or publishing books or anything of that nature, so I was like, but anyway, I decided to take the leap and learn everything you need to learn about publishing books. And yeah, I put it all together and got Eliza Fricker on board for illustrations, and she's amazing. And, it all came together. I think it came together in a very autistic ADHD fashion. And it happened quite rapidly. I started writing, I wrote the very first story, I think, in June, and I had the books in my hand by January. So it was a very, very fast turnaround. But yeah, I think I just wanted to share, stories that people could relate to and, that didn't make people feel so alone in their experiences. And so, like they were the only ones going through the things that they were going through.
Okay, so can you speak of how narrative and storytelling can support identity formation in autistic and ADHD youth?
Definitely. I think that storytelling is such a powerful avenue for exploring things that, might feel a little maybe demanding or a little confronting to kind of just explore, in, just talk therapy or kind of things like that. I think that narratives or storytelling let us kind of explore things with a little bit more distance and, explore things creatively. So I use a lot of, I guess, like metaphors and, storytelling in my therapy, when I'm supporting my clients. Because I think it can be a really powerful way to explore something that feels a little bit more mm, more comfortable and sometimes more enjoyable. But also, can let us explore things a little bit more broadly. So, we don't only have to speak about our own experiences. We can bring in the experiences of others. We can write things, things can have a different ending than they did in real life. We can add, other details and, really explore things in a way that feels right and most comfortable for us.
Okay, so your group program, Building Your Neurodivergent Identity, spans kids, teens, adults, and parents. What have you observed about how identity develops across those life stages?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think there's probably two layers to that question. Because I think that it's very different to work with kiddos who are aware of their neurotype and are also being supported in a really neurodivergent affirming way. Um, And then, supporting adults who, often have been late identified and so didn't really have the opportunity to have that neurodiversity affirming upbringing or develop that self-compassion and understanding. They're kind of trying to develop that as an adult. And I think, even in a lot of earlier identified adults, most of them still didn't have that neurodiversity affirming upbringing. So, in my kiddos groups, it's so magical to watch, groups of kiddos talking about their shared neurotypes and talking about their shared experiences and, really being able to connect with each other around that and, feel quite safe and connected in that space and, just being able to celebrate who they are and being their authentic selves. So, that's just so beautiful to think that they've got that from such an early age and, they're able to build on that as they grow. I think the teen years can be really tricky because I think that the teen years often feels a lot more unsafe to not be, to not fit in with the norm or the expected, I guess. So, anything that kind of sits outside of the average for a teen often feels quite unsafe. And so, I think that it can be really important to be quite delicate in that stage in terms of, we don't want to come on too hard in terms of being really, affirming and really strengths-based, when a lot of the time they might be like, I wish I wasn't autistic. It would probably make it easier right now. They also, teens can often find it really hard to, put accommodations in place because they don't want to look different. So often they'll just try and, get through it. So I find that can be a really tricky stage in terms of, how best to support identity at that stage. And I guess I often really focus on just following the lead of the individual and kind of seeing where they are at in that stage. I think for adults, as I said, most of the adults that I support are late identified. And so I guess it is still a new identity phase for them. So, just as potentially as the kiddos that are understanding their neurotype, these adults are understanding their neurotype and kind of I find, I often talk about it like it's a new pair of glasses that you can put on to, kind of look at your life going backwards and how that's been and, different experiences and how you can now reframe them with that different lens of understanding things through, this different neurotype and, being able to rewrite your story, I guess, as an adult. So I definitely find there are different, I guess, identity explorations at each kind of age and stage, but I think we haven't yet had, a generation that have gone through from childhood to adulthood with that really neurodiversity affirming approach and, that understanding of their neurotypes throughout their life in a way that actually was helpful for them.
Okay, so how do trained facilitators across Australia and New Zealand support your mission for neurodiversity affirming spaces?
I am so excited that I've been able to train some people in my in delivering my program, and I'm hoping to expand on that further. I think I love supporting clients one-on-one, but I think the absolute pleasure and privilege of being able to connect people in spaces with people that share their neurotype, that feel safe, where they're able to be authentic, where they're able to maybe make more longer term connections. I just think that's so powerful, and I just think it's something that all autistic and ADHDers should have an opportunity to be able to engage in. And so I did look into cloning and did think about if that was an option. Apparently it's not an option yet. So I kind of decided the next best thing would be if I could train people to deliver the program, then, more and more people across Australia and, excitingly, I've been able to deliver it, for some folk in New Zealand as well. But the more people that, are trained in these sort of things and in a neurodiversity affirming approach, the more people are going to have access to those services. And, I would love nothing more than for, everyone to have access to, really fantastic neurodiversity affirming services and supports that just, help them in whatever way feels right for them on their journey.
Okay, so you emphasize the neurodiversity affirming lens in assessments. What does that look like in practice during autism and ADHD evaluations?
Yep. I think that it means, quite a few different things. So I guess starting with the basics, I guess a neurodiversity affirming lens when we're looking at autism and ADHD assessments is reframing, our understanding of autism and ADHD around, away from that really disordered, deficit-based language and understanding. So, we're not looking for, deficits. We're looking for different ways of being. So, when we're looking at autism, we're looking at different ways of communicating, at different ways of relating to people and building relationships, at different needs, for consistency, for predictability, at different sensory experiences, at different ways of relating to interests. So, I think that framing is so important from the start. I think it's still quite a tricky space in that we still have to operate under a medical model in terms of, diagnoses and in terms of people being able to access services and things like that. So there is still the medical framework, I guess, that we have to operate within. But it's really, starting from the bare basics in terms of how we understand these as neurotypes, not as disorders. I think that then, moves on to the practice of assessments. So, I'm quite passionate about assessments being collaborative. So I guess I often say, look, I know a lot about autism and ADHD. I read a lot, I listen to a lot, I learn a lot, but the person in front of me is the expert on their life and their internal experiences, so it's about us coming together and working together to kind of put our information together and put it into a framework that makes sense to both of us. I think, thinking about, neurodiversity affirming practice more generally, it's things like making accommodations during the assessment process. So, maybe some people prefer to type, maybe some people prefer to talk, maybe some people, need to move around a lot while they're talking, or maybe some people need to fidget while they're talking, or maybe some people need to, stand up and walk around while they're talking. Things like, providing a lot of information so that they really understand what the process is going to look like and what each step looks like. And, so they can ask questions when they want to ask questions in whatever way works for them. And, making sure that they are feeling comfortable, on each step of the way. And I guess really being quite person-centered and, making sure that we're looking at each individual and thinking how we can best support that individual in front of us. I think as well, and particularly with kiddos, so sometimes when people are assessing particularly autism, some of, our more dated assessment practices often make the person quite uncomfortable. And they, they're very much behaviorally based. So it's about what can the person observe rather than bringing in those internal experiences. I think that we shouldn't ever be making somebody uncomfortable, particularly if there's a way we can get that information without doing that. So, I often would use the example of, if somebody needed to do a blood test, that a needle might hurt and be uncomfortable, but maybe that's the only way to get that information. Whereas if we could get the exact same information, by putting a sticker on someone's hand, we'd probably want to take that option, because why are we going to put someone through something hurtful when we don't have to, when we can get that information in a different way? So often my sessions, for example, when I'm assessing kiddos, we might be exploring sensory objects together, we might be reading books together or playing games together, we might be talking about their interests, and they might, be telling me different facts about their interests. So, they're probably going to enjoy, or at least feel more comfortable with, the assessment process than if I was getting them to do things that made them feel a bit uncomfortable.
Okay, so how do you balance co-signing reports with a clinical psychologist versus empowering clients to seek funding themselves?
Yeah, it's a tricky world at the moment with NDIS. So I think when it comes to NDIS, I guess I always make really clear, because I want to make sure, that my practices are really ethical and that people are really informed, and make the choices that feel best for them. So, any registered psychologist who is appropriately trained in an area can make diagnoses. So there is no requirement for diagnoses to be made by a clinical psychologist. Some agencies have decided that that's what they require. And so, I guess I always make sure I communicate that information. For those agencies, again, they can sometimes be less consistent about whether they follow their rules that they've set or whether they don't. So, I think that can be a really tricky thing, is that sometimes there's a lot of inconsistency. I think as well, it's I guess for me, it's just making sure that people are really well informed and that they're able to make informed consent. So it's, this is what the situation might be. This is all the information that you need. You make the choice that feels like the right choice for you. And I guess in situations where I have done assessments and NDIS has said, no, these need to be signed by a clinical psychologist, I guess I always want to make sure that we're supporting people as best as we can to actually, access the services and the supports that they need. So, I know that a lot of registered psychologists try to work, closely with some clinical psychologists so that they're not preventing access to support because of these rules or, restrictions that different, I guess, systems have put in place.
Okay, so what are your thoughts on the double empathy problem and how it influences clinician-client relationships?
Big question. So I guess the double empathy problem is something that I talk about quite frequently. And I think it's really key understanding, when we're supporting autistic folk in particular. So I guess, bare basics, the double empathy problem illustrates to us that it's not about deficits in communication, it's about differences in communication. And so, I absolutely love one of the first, I guess, experimental studies that they did in this area. They played the game called Telephone, which is where they pass a message up a line to the end. And they played that with a group of all autistic people, a group of all non-autistic people, and a group of mixed neurotype people. and the autistic people and the non-autistic people performed equally well. It was the mixed neurotype group that performed worse, which clearly illustrates that relationship, that it's between neurotype, or it's a kind of mismatch communication thing that happens, rather than this group is better at communicating than this group. So I think, it's so key for us to understand, one, that there is that communication difference, two, to understand that both sides communicate well, but it's when the mismatch happens in the middle that stuff goes, can go wrong. And then from that understanding, it's actually the responsibility of both sides to figure out how best to meet in the middle. So I think that, historically it's been framed as the responsibility of the autistic person to adapt their communication style to suit non-autistic people, which, isn't fair, I don't think. So, it's that recognition that, hey, we both need to be working on this to make sure that we're both being understood as we're supposed to be by other people. I have a really good side quest. I have a really good story that I like to use when I talk about double empathy problems, so I hope it's okay. It's not too long. I was traveling in Italy, and I have some Italian friends, and I was with them at a shopping centre. Now, I speak the tiniest bit of Italian and not very well, but they speak really fantastic English, so I was pretty lucky there. Now, one of them turned to me and said, "Chelsea, are you angry?" And I was like, "Oh, no, I don't think so." And they were like, "Oh, are you angry?" And I'm like, "No, don't think I'm, no. Are you angry?" And by that point I was like, "Oh, hang on, have I missed something? Is there something I should be angry about?" And I was like, "Oh," and I said, I really don't know if I'm understanding you right. Can you give me any more information?" And they said, "Oh, are you angry? There's a food court around the corner." And I was like, "Oh, am I hungry?" And they're like, "Yeah," because obviously to them it sounded the same. And I was
yeah,
like,
of course. Yeah, that
"Ah,
makes sense.
yes, I am hungry. Great, let's go and get some food." And so in that situation, it wasn't that, it wasn't a them problem, it wasn't a me problem. It was a miscommunication, and they didn't know that I wasn't understanding what they were trying to say. I didn't know what they were trying to say. But actually we were able to meet in the middle by me going, "Oh, I think I'm missing something," and then them giving me some more information, which helped us actually get to where we wanted to be, where we both understood each other. And I just really like that story because I think it's such a nice story illustrating essentially the double empathy problem, in that, it's no one's fault. It's just there are two very different communication styles, and it's actually on all of us to work together and meet in the middle. And that's going to lead to better outcomes for everybody, really, in terms of making sure we're all being understood. I forget the
Okay.
second part of that question. I don't know if I answered the
No,
whole
it
thing.
sounded great. So you
Sure.
mentioned being committed to walking alongside others to understand their lived world. How do you feel your own identity shapes and enhances this empathetic approach?
I think I think that being an autistic ADHDer clinician for autistic and ADHD clients, I think it does give an advantage a lot of the time, in that I think the more I'm able to understand my own experiences, the more I'm able to, wonder or be curious as to whether the people I support have had similar experiences. I think that one of the things, like one of the big benefits that comes from understanding your neurotype and your identity, is being able to access shared language and being able to access shared experiences. Because I find that a lot of people might not be able to give words or might not really understand what's been going on for them. But if they're able to hear somebody else say, you know, hey, this is something that I found really tricky, or hey, this is something that I struggled with in that sort of situation, they're more readily able to go, oh, that's it. Yes, that's it. That's what I've struggled with, or that's the way that, yeah, I would describe that. I just didn't have the words for it. So, you know, I like to think that supporting clients is about us meeting in the middle, you know, similar to the double empathy problem, in that, you know, I'm never going to understand everything that they've been through and all of their experiences, you know, and my job is to kind of guide, I guess, in terms with the information that I know, but also them bringing their information and us kind of putting that together again in terms of, you know, helping them to understand and potentially reframe their experiences. And I find that, yeah, as I said, having some of those experiences myself can, I think, make it easier for me to be able to, you know, put myself in their shoes, I guess, essentially. And I don't think I don't think that means that non-autistic or non-ADHD clinicians can't be great support for autistic and ADHD clients. Not at all. I just think sometimes when you have that shared experience, it can just take a layer off, you know, that maybe you're not having to pull so much from other people's understanding. You've got that
Okay.
lived experience.
So, how have you navigated professional life as both a psychologist and an autistic ADHDer? Were there challenges to embracing your authenticity?
Definitely. I think that there's still, you know, we still very much live in a society where there are expectations around professionalism and around, you know, what therapy looks like and what, you know, what you should present yourself like in a professional role and in a professional setting. I think that initially, I guess I was probably quite masked in the you know, in my early days. I think that as I've come to understand myself a little bit better, and as I've come to, you know, feel more comfortable in being authentic and in doing, you know, what works for me, I guess my practice probably looks a little bit different than, you know, it would be expected to be in some settings. I find a lot of the things like networking or like, you know, small talk with people like colleagues that I don't really know. I find a lot of those things really tricky. And so I don't tend to do a lot of those sort of things. But I think what I've done is made my practice work for me. And, you know, in turn, that seems to work for most of my clients. So, you know, I wear, you know, t-shirts and like, you know, comfy pants, and I don't wear shoes in my office. And you know, my office doesn't have the big lights, it just has lamps, and there's lots of soft blankets and, you know, fidgets and stuff everywhere. And, you know, I'm almost constantly fidgeting with something when I'm at work. And, you know, I think I've tried to bring authenticity into my role as a psychologist, which, you know, I don't think was easy at the start, but now, you know, it's meant that actually I can practice the way that I want to practice, which I think has been quite a benefit.
Okay. So, what advice would you give to neurodivergent individuals struggling with masking or finding an authentic sense of belonging?
I think the biggest thing that we have to consider in those sort of like when we're wanting people to be able to be authentic is that people have to be safe to be authentic. So we can't just say, you know, unmask, embrace yourself, you know, if people don't have the safety to be able to do that. And so, you know, I guess the first thing I will start with people is, how do we find safe places for you? Or how do we create safe places for you to be able to actually do that in the first place? And then I think the second part of that is once we've found and established some safety, is is looking at, well, who actually are you underneath this? Who is the authentic you? Because I think particularly for late identified folk, or, folk who maybe were early identified but weren't supported, throughout their life to embrace their authentic self, often our authentic self is quite hidden, and often that might even be to us. So, it's sometimes about that really long, slow, deliberate journey of finding what actually sits underneath, and finding, what that person needs in terms of their support needs, and what accommodations they might need, or what their sensory needs might be, or what sort of executive functioning support they might need. And then I guess I really like exploring, what brings them joy, what brings them meaning, what makes them feel, just completely lit up as a person, and I think that can be part of that moving from surviving to thriving, is, getting to that point where we can start looking at what makes this person happy, what brings them joy, and how do we bring more of that into their lives.
Okay, and last question we'd like to ask everybody here on the Deep Dive podcast. If there's one bit of advice in 30 seconds or less that you would like to give, what would that be?
30 seconds or less. Holy moly, that's very stressful. 30 seconds or less, one bit of advice for everyone in the world, or for people for themselves?
Just for basically, yeah, it could be either or.
If it's for the world, let's aim for a more inclusive society that supports all members of the society, and all of the different varieties of fantastic humans that we have. That would be just absolutely fantastic if we could all actively be working towards that.
And on that note, Chelsea Luca, thank you so much for being part of the Deep Dive podcast today.
Thank you very much for having me.
You can connect with Chelsea at connectuspsychology.com